Hey guys, this is for the sophomores. Just a little bit of a note. My second section, my fourth period class, we experienced some real technical problems. Where we pretty much lost the connection. So what I'm going to do in this video is for the first few minutes, I'm going to do all the stuff that I was supposed to do with you if we hadn't had that glitch. So the third period does not have to listen to this part, and I'll put in the comment, well, not comment section, but in the caption, I'll put where period 3 should start listening. Period 4, the class where I had the technical problems, you should listen to the entire video. But period 3, I'll tell you in the caption where you should start listening, because you already heard some of this stuff. Okay, so Martin Van Buren entered the presidency in March 1837. He was elected the previous year, basically coasting on Andrew Jackson's incredible popularity. Van Buren, remember, had been Jackson's hand-picked successor as president. And the thing is that Van Buren was a brilliant political leader, probably the shrewdest politician that we had of the era. He built the New York political machine, the Albany Regency, into a powerhouse, probably the nation's most important political machine. He basically created the Democratic Party as a way to advance Andrew Jackson's career. And shrewd and calculating, they called him the little magician or the sly fox, because they said he always had a trick up his sleeve. He was always such a brilliant politician. Interesting things about Van Buren. He was the first president born an American citizen, because all the previous presidents have been born before the United States got our independence. He was the first president who wasn't of British descent. He was Dutch. Van. Anytime you hear Van in somebody's name, that means they're Dutch. And his first language was Dutch. He didn't learn English until he was older, and they said he actually, the Dutch accent came out every once in a while. So the thing is that Van Buren entered office, with all of Jackson's popularity, because Van Buren was so tight with Jackson. But almost immediately, the nation experienced a severe economic depression, or a panic. It was known as the Panic of 1837. We don't really use that term much anymore, panic, but panic means a depression, basically. They kind of stopped using that word at... sorry about that. They stopped using that word really after the Great Depression in 1929. But anytime you read in American history in the 19th century and they're talking about a panic, they're talking about a depression. This was the worst depression the country had ever known. The Panic of 1837. Now, why did it happen? Some of it is just the boom and bust nature of capitalism, right? Unregulated capitalism leads to economic depressions every 15, 20 years. It always does. It's just kind of the nature of things. And there were a lot of people at the time who accepted, in fact, most people just kind of accepted that. Yeah, well, sometimes the economy collapses. Now we don't really accept that as much, right? Most people, more liberals than conservatives believe this, but generally, most people believe that the government at least has some role to play if the economy gets really bad. The biggest reason, though, was Jackson's economic policies. Jackson killed the Bank of the United States, and as much as that might have appealed to a lot of regular people, to a lot of poor people, you need a central bank, or you need a bank in order to regulate the currency, stabilize the economy, all of that. And if you kill it and don't replace it really with anything, you're going to have problems. Remember, Jackson placed all the money he withdrew from the Bank of the United States. He put it in these local pet banks. He issued the specie circular, which said if you want to buy land, you have to buy it in gold or silver, as opposed to paper money, which was issued by some of these banks. So when he did that, it kind of contracted the whole economy. It stiffened it up. Not stiffened it up, but it kind of ground to a halt, because the economy, it kind of becomes so dependent on paper money that without it, if you say everything has to be bought in gold or silver, it just contracts the economy. So Jackson he was not president when the results of his policies began hitting. He had already left office and retired, but Van Buren was the one who really had to experience the fallout of a lot of Jackson's economic policies. Cotton prices have been collapsing at this time, and cotton is a very important U.S. export. British banks began tightening credit. Remember, banks in the United States were totally unstable as a result of Jackson. So a lot of people relied on British credit, and a lot of British banks were more reluctant to give Americans credit with cotton prices collapsing. So it's basically a perfect storm of trouble. The money supply in America fell by a third during the Panic of 1837. Half of all New York City workers lost their jobs as a result of the Depression. Wages, those people got to keep their jobs, wages went down 35% on average during the Panic of 1837. There were tons of bank failures, including the old Bank of the United States, which was being run as just a regular bank out of Philadelphia. It collapsed in the Panic of 1837. So things were really bad. Now, what was Martin Van Buren's response? Van Buren's response to the Depression was really not much of anything. He was a laissez-faire Democrat. Now, laissez-faire means somebody who believes that the government should not be intervening in the economy. Laissez-faire can just kind of be a broader term to say the government shouldn't be intervening, period. But specifically, it's used to describe someone who believes the government should really not be regulating the economy. Should be regulating wages, shouldn't be regulating hours, shouldn't be trying to help people who are poor. So Jackson too, I guess. Van Buren as a Democrat was a laissez-faire person. Whigs generally believed the government should have a much bigger role in the economy. So Van Buren did really next to nothing. And again, it really wasn't an unusual position for a politician at the time. Most politicians, certainly all Democrats and even a lot of Whigs generally did not believe like the government should help you if you're poor or anything like that. That was just not the thinking. That didn't really become a thing or an idea that was commonly accepted really until the early 20th century. People said, well, the economy is bad. What does that have to do with the government? Why does that mean the government has to help people? Van Buren's big idea in terms of dealing with the Depression was something called the independent sub-treasury. Now, he thought that one of the big problems was that the government had no place to keep its money. Since the Bank of the United States, it collapsed, and then the state banks were irresponsible. So Van Buren said if the government kept a separate account, a separate treasury to keep its money, that would stabilize the economy. Whigs generally did not believe in this proposal because Whigs wanted to bring back the Bank of the United States. But ultimately, the independent sub-treasury did pass, even though it was repealed the next year. But then it was ultimately brought back in 1846. And this was basically the way that the government had of storing its money up until the Federal Reserve System, which was passed in 1913. So Van Buren's idea actually was our government's main, really sole way of storing its money for the next 70 plus years. Now, Democrats continue to blame banks for the crisis as opposed to Andrew Jackson or Martin Van Buren. Many embrace the idea of hard money. They said hard money means paying things in gold or silver. They say these irresponsible banks had issued so much paper money that that's actually what destabilized the whole economy, even though that's not really correct. Arkansas and Louisiana actually banned banks completely. Those were Democratic strongholds, and they said, well, banks caused the Depression, so let's get rid of banks. And tight restrictions were placed on paper money by Democrats at the state level because, again, Democrats blame banks and their irresponsible practices for causing the Depression, as opposed to government policies. Okay, this is the 9-minute mark. So from this point on, everybody should watch both the third and the fourth period. So the fourth period should have watched for the first 9 minutes, and then continue to watch. Third period, you start right now because this will be all new stuff. Now, the presidential election came around in 1840, and as you can imagine, Martin Van Buren was not in really good shape. Even though people really didn't expect the government to do much of anything, people did expect the government to do something, and Van Buren really was doing nothing. to really deal with the Depression. And the Whigs sensed that they could actually win this thing. Remember, all three of their candidates in 1836 got 49% of the vote. So all they need is another 1.1% of the vote to actually win the next presidential election. And with this economic depression going on, with the Democrats bearing a lot of the blame for the economic depression, the Whigs sensed they could actually win this thing. Even in Martin Van Buren's home state of New York, the Whigs had actually done well in midterm elections. In 1840, the Whigs had to decide who they were going to nominate for president. The early frontrunner was Henry Clay. Henry Clay was the founder of the party, the legendary politician, legendary political figure. And the thing is that Henry Clay was expecting the Whig Party nomination, but he had been in politics for so many years and made so many enemies that a lot of Whigs, even the party he founded, really did not believe that he was the guy who could actually, win a general election and go up against Van Buren. Famously, when Clay thought he was about to lose the election because of positions he had taken, Clay said, "I'd rather be right than be president." One of my old students from years ago, she knows I'm a big Henry Clay fan. She actually bought me this little plaque. "I would rather be right than be president." Henry Clay's famous quote. And it's still in my bookcase, as you see. Let's see if I can put this back. Okay, there we go. So the thing is that Clay did not get the nomination. He'd rather be right than be president. He wasn't going to be president in 1840. And the Whigs instead nominated William Henry Harrison for president. Now, old Tippecanoe. We talked a little about him in our live class. Old Tippecanoe, William Henry Harrison, had won the Battle of Tippecanoe against Tecumseh, the Indian chief, back in 1811. Yes, that was like 30 years earlier, but Harrison was basically using that fame from that battle 30 years earlier, which was a victory over the Indian tribes, but not really. It was kind of like it was barely a victory. He lost 900 men, even though he had a much stronger force. But this sort of victory was enough to kind of catapult Harrison to fame, and he basically used that fame from that battle to launch his political career, which for the next 30 years was basically an up and down political career. He was in the House, he was in the Senate, he was kind of in this Ohio's home state, his Ohio State Senate, so he kind of like had offices for a couple of years here and there, but it wasn't a very successful career. When John Quincy Adams became president, he was lobbying Adams for a job, and Adams, when he found out that Harrison had just been nominated for president, Adams, who's now the former president, who was currently serving in Congress, actually remarked quite snidely that I never knew a greater beggar in my whole time as president than William Henry Harrison, basically always asking for a job. Ultimately, he made Harrison the ambassador to Colombia. But then Jackson became president, and he was ultimately fired, so he actually didn't even spend much time in Colombia. And he was a court clerk. He made some money. He had a huge family he had to support. Like, a lot of his children died tragically, so he was supporting a lot of grandchildren. So he actually wasn't like, a big political figure by 1840. But the Whigs thought that they could use Harrison's fame from the Battle of Tippecanoe 30 years earlier to actually make Harrison almost into a Jackson-like figure, this military hero who decides he wants to get into politics for the benefit of the people. And they presented him as a humble man of the people, former military hero in the tradition of Washington and Jackson. This image of Harrison as this humble man of the people was really a striking contrast to reality. Harrison was 67 years old by this time, so that was quite old by 1840 standards. That would probably be someone like in their 80s today. He lived in a 22-room mansion in Ohio, so he wasn't exactly living like a humble man like the Whigs tried to make him out. His father had signed the Declaration of Independence, so he was from a prominent family. So this image of Harrison as this humble man of the people was really in stark contrast to the reality, where he was actually quite wealthy. He always needed money, as because that's why he's always looking for work. But he was still quite comfortable. So he's the Whig Party nominee. The Whigs nominated Henry Clay Excuse me, no, they didn't. They nominated. They did nominate Clay. They nominated John Tyler for vice president. John Tyler's from Virginia, kind of a big plantation owner, slave owner. So and Harrison was a northerner, even though Harrison's family roots were in Virginia as well. But they thought this would balance the ticket by having this northern general with this southern slave owning politician. Tyler actually was barely a Whig. When he was a senator, he got into like some problems with Andrew Jackson, and because of that, he became a Whig. But his principles were still basically Democratic Party principles, and that came back to haunt the Whig Party the next year, which we'll talk about when we have our live class, because he really wasn't a committed Whig. But the Whig ticket in 1840 was called Tippecanoe and Tyler too. Very catchy, right? And they hope to ride that to victory. Now, the Democrats renominated Martin Van Buren, who still had solid control over the party that he created. The Democrats were very dismissive of Harrison. They called him old granny, because of his age. And probably the most fateful decision is when a Democratic newspaper to criticize Harrison and basically say like he's like whatever. They said like all he wants to do is sit around in his log cabin drinking hard cider. Hard cider is kind of like an alcoholic drink that was popular on the frontier. So when they said this, they were trying to make fun of Harrison. They were saying like, "Oh, he just sits around in a log cabin drinking cider. He shouldn't be president." But the Whigs decided to run with that, and they said, "Yes, that's exactly right. He's a humble man of the people. He just drinks cider and sits in a log cabin." So the thing is that the Whigs then made that whole image of Harris, this humble man of the people, drinking hard cider, living in a log cabin. They made that their campaign slogan. They're rugged frontiersmen who want to live simply, and their entire campaign revolved around that theme: hard cider and log cabin and hard cider. And log cabin became a theme for the Whigs. The Whig Party headquarters, the Harrison campaign headquarters, was a giant log cabin. People used to draw little log cabins, and if they held them up, they said that, this means I'm a Harrison supporter. The log cabin symbol became a symbol for the Harrison campaign. So they totally ran with this. They were like, he's just like you. You're poor too, probably, and and live in a log cabin. So's Harrison. But again, no, he didn't. He lived in a 22-room mansion. Now, the weird thing is that Harrison, whose father had signed the Declaration of Independence and lived in a mansion, was being portrayed as this humble man of the people living in a log cabin. It was actually Martin Van Buren, who grew up pretty poor. His parents owned a tavern, like a little bar. He was not from anywhere near the kind of background that Harrison was. But Van Buren was being portrayed by the Whigs as a wannabe aristocrat. Now, Van Buren did have some expensive habits. He liked to wear very fancy clothes. He liked to drink expensive wine from silver goblets. He had, when he ate, he had, between courses, like, there are 7-course meals or whatever. So you have a salad, some, a few main courses, dessert, all that. So in between courses, he used to dip his fingers in like a finger bowl, which is like this, to kind of get the whatever off his hands. So that sounds a little like, fancy and aristocratic, right? Most Americans were not using finger bowls. He wore a girdle because he had a belly. Like, that's like Spanx, like to kind of hide his belly. He wore fancy leather gloves. So he was kind of dandyish. So even though he came from a humble background, his whole image was really a fancy aristocrat. And just imagine what an attack like that could mean at a time of an economic depression when people are actually living quite badly, right? And their president is basically sitting around eating many course meals off of fine china and drinking wine from fancy silver goblets. Martin Van Buren, sometimes they call him Matty, which is a variation of Martin. Matty, number 8 president, eats his meals from a golden plate. Was a slogan that the Whigs had in 1840. To kind of like mock Van Buren, and it was very successful. Harrison was really the first presidential candidate to actually campaign for president. He traveled the nation by railroad, which was still a pretty novel innovation at the time, the railroads. They were just starting, and with that Tippecanoe and Tyler too slogan, Harris, and also his the Whig Party's embrace of this hard side of log cabin image, and also these attacks on Van Buren were ultimately successful. And with this, it was a very effective campaign. And with the Depression, Harris was ultimately victorious. He won 53% of the vote to Van Buren's 47%. In the electoral votes, Harrison won 234 electoral votes to 60 electoral votes for Van Buren. Interestingly, this election had the highest turnout in American history. 80% of white men actually turned out to vote. And also, I think it's kind of interesting that even though Van Buren was not regarded as a successful president because of the way he handled the Depression, he still won 47% of the vote. So that's pretty good for a president who's kind of seen as, not kind of a failure. But this campaign, the 1840 campaign, is a very significant one. It's usually one of the most important elections that are studied by political historians. It was really seen as the first modern campaign where a candidate and a party used slogans, modern techniques. They had parades for Harrison, embracing, creating an image around Harrison, in order to try to get him elected. So it was the first modern campaign, and it was also this realization that now politicians had to directly appeal to the people in order to win elections. That it wasn't just going to be like the elite who decided who was going to be president. All of these appeals that the Whigs were making were an attempt to try to appeal to regular people. The election also showed the strength of the second party system. Remember the second party system, which had been around since 1834, so 6 years between the Democrats and the Whigs. It was a fully fledged party system. Both parties had clear and contrasting visions for where they wanted to take the country. They had agendas. They had positions. So the Whigs and the Democrats were both fully fleshed out parties who believed in things. And they also each had committed supporters who were willing to kind of go to the polls and support them. As you can see, Van Buren, performing so well in the election, even though his presidency was generally seen as inept. So in the history of American presidential elections, the 1841 is seen as one of the most significant because it was the first modern campaign. All right, guys. So very good. So I'll put the notes on the bottom where I want the third period, where I want the fourth period to watch. And for our next class, our live class, we'll talk about William Henry Harrison's presidency and like how it ultimately wound up. Not as he or his supporters expected, put it that way. All right, so I'll see you all for our live class on Monday. Hopefully there'll be no technological glitches then. All right, have a great weekend, guys.